How 300 Poles defeated 40,000 Russians. The Battle of Hodow, 300 men, 40,000 enemies, a small wooden church. What happened at Hodow defies all military logic and remains one of the most impossible victories in history. On June 11, 1694, in a forgotten village on the Polish border, a small detachment of Polish cavalry faced the largest Tatar army ever assembled in that region. What should have been a massacre turned into a legend. This is the story of the Battle of Hodow, where faith, strategy, and courage defied impossible numbers. If you're fascinated by epic stories of war and military strategy, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content. 17th century Poland was a kingdom in a constant state of war. Its eastern borders were regularly attacked by Tatar hordes from Crimea, allied with the Ottoman Empire. These attacks were not merely military. They were expeditions of plunder and slave grabbing that devastated entire villages, driving thousands of Poles to the slave markets of the south. In June 1694, intelligence reports brought alarming news. A massive Tatar army, estimated at between 30,000 and 40,000 warriors, had crossed the border and was advancing through Polish territory. Led by experienced commanders, these nomadic horsemen were feared for their speed, brutality, and blitzkrieg tactics. Their objective was clear: to plunder as much as possible and capture slaves before the Polish army could mobilize. The Podolia region was practically defenseless. The bulk of the Polish forces were far away, dealing with other threats. All that remained in the area were small detachments of light cavalry, known as pancerni, and some Hungarian mercenary soldiers. The local commander, Colonel Samuel Szembakowski, realized that it was impossible to stop such a force in open field. But he had a desperate plan: to find a defensive position and buy enough time for the local peasants to flee so that the main forces could arrive. The choice fell on Hodow, a small village with a fortified wooden church on top of a hill. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Szembakowski gathered approximately 100 Polish soldiers, 100 registered Cossacks, and about 100 armed peasants. In total, about 300 men to face a sea of enemies. The math was simple and brutal. Each defender would have to fight against more than 100 attackers. The chances of survival were practically zero. Szembakowski knew that the only chance of survival lay in transforming Hodow into an unlikely fortress. The wooden church of St. John the Baptist became the focal point of the defense. Although not a true military fortification, it had thick walls and was situated on high ground, offering some advantage. The Poles worked frantically to improve the defenses. Barricades were erected using carts, logs, and anything else that could be found. Sharpened stakes were driven into the ground around the perimeter to hinder cavalry. Charges, reserves of ammunition, water, and food were stored inside the church. Each soldier received clear instructions: fire only when the enemy was at close range to ensure that every shot counted. Fire discipline would be essential, as ammunition was limited. The Cossacks, known for their skill with muskets and guerrilla tactics, were positioned at strategic points. The peasants, though less trained, received basic weapons and instructions to defend specific sectors. Szembakowski divided his forces into relay groups, ensuring there were always rested men ready to fight. He knew the battle could last for days. On the morning of June 11th, the horizon darkened. It wasn't storm clouds, it was dust kicked up by tens of thousands of horses. The Tatar horde had arrived. Their banners fluttered in the wind as the commanders surveyed the small fortified settlement ahead. Initially, it must have seemed like a joke, a symbolic resistance that would be crushed in minutes. The Tatars were experienced warriors who had sacked countless cities and defeated armies far larger than that handful of defenders. The war drums began to sound. The siege of Hodow was about to begin, and everyone inside that small church knew they were looking at death. But instead of despair, there was determination. They would fight to the last man, to the last shot, to the last drop of blood. There was no other option. The attack began with a hail of arrows that darkened the sky. Thousands of Tatar archers fired simultaneously, their arrows falling on the Polish barricades like a deadly storm. The defenders took cover behind their makeshift defenses, waiting for the right moment. Zembikowski walked among his men, remaining calm, ordering them to wait. Then came the first wave of cavalry. Hundreds of Tatar horsemen galloped towards the barricades, shouting their war cries, confident that they would simply trample over that ridiculous defense. But Zembikowski waited until they were dangerously close before giving the order to fire. A hail of muskets and improvised cannons exploded from the Polish defenses. The effect was devastating. At close range, the shots tore through the Tatar ranks, felling knights and horses. The first wave disintegrated in confusion, bodies falling, riderless horses running in panic. The attackers retreated, surprised by the ferocity of the response. They had expected symbolic resistance, not an organized and lethal defense. But the Tatars were experienced warriors and would not give up easily. A second wave was launched, this time from multiple directions, attempting to divide the defenders' attention. Again, the Poles held their positions, firing with disciplined precision, making every shot count. The Cossacks, masters of the art of border warfare, anticipated enemy movements and concentrated fire on the weak points of the attacking formations. The hours turned into a brutal cycle of attack and defense. Successive waves of Tatar cavalry charged against the barricades, only to be repelled by musket fire and unwavering determination. The ground around Hodow began to be covered with bodies. Gunpowder smoke mingled with the dust raised by thousands of horses, creating a suffocating fog over the battlefield. Inside the barricades, the Poles fought with desperate fury. The wounded were dragged behind the lines where they received basic treatment before returning to the fight. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Water was shared in small sips, but no one spoke of surrender. Death in battle was infinitely preferable to the fate that awaited them as slaves in the Ottoman markets. They would fight to the end, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the day wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Ammunition was running out rapidly. The men were exhausted from hours of uninterrupted combat, and the Tatars seemed endless. For every attacker killed, 10 more took their place. It was mathematically impossible for the defenders to continue resisting much longer. It was then that something extraordinary happened, something that Polish survivors would later describe as miraculous. According to accounts from the time, a luminous figure of a woman appeared above the church, holding a protective mantle over the defenders. Many identified the apparition as the Virgin Mary, patron saint of Poland. Whether it was a shared vision, an atmospheric phenomenon misinterpreted in the chaos of battle, or simply faith, manifested in moments of extreme danger, we will never know for sure. What we do know is that the effect was real. The Polish defenders, invigorated by the belief that they were under divine protection, fought with renewed fervor. Simultaneously, something changed among the Tatar attackers. Their assaults became less coordinated, more hesitant. Rumors began to spread among their ranks about supernatural signs, bad omens, defenses impossible to break through. The psychology of war is an often underestimated factor. The Tatars had expected an easy and quick victory, but hours of brutal combat had produced hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties, without significant gains. The small fortification continued to resist, defying all logic. To superstitious warriors who interpreted signs and omens, this began to seem like a bad omen. As night fell on the first day, the Tatar attacks lessened in intensity. The attacking forces retreated beyond the range of Polish muskets, regrouping and debating their next move. Inside the barricades, the defenders used the temporary truce to treat the wounded, resupply positions, and prepare for what would surely be a renewed attack at dawn. Dębkowski made a cold assessment of the situation. They had survived the first day against impossible odds, but ammunition was critically low. If the Tatars launched a coordinated all-out attack the following morning, it would be the end. The only hope was that the attackers would lose their appetite for battle, or that Polish reinforcements would arrive in time. Both possibilities seemed equally improbable. The dawn of the second day brought an unexpected surprise. The Tatars, instead of launching the devastating final attack everyone expected, began to retreat. Their massive forces, which could easily have crushed the exhausted defenders, simply turned around and began to march away. The Tatar commanders had made a strategic decision. The losses were too high for the potential gain, and there were easier targets elsewhere. For the defenders of Hodow, it was like waking from a nightmare. They had faced an army 100 times larger during hours of brutal combat and survived. Of the approximately 300 people who defended the position, roughly 30 died and many more were wounded. On the Tatar side, estimates of losses vary widely, but probably hundreds, possibly thousands of warriors were killed or wounded in the repeated assaults. News of the incredible victory spread rapidly throughout Poland and beyond. Hodow instantly became a legend, a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. The wooden church where it all happened was considered sacred, a place of miracles. In the following years, it became an important pilgrimage site, and a larger church was eventually built on the site to commemorate the battle. For military strategy, Hodow offers important lessons. The battle demonstrated the value of prepared defense against superior forces, the importance of fire, discipline and troop morale, and how psychological factors can influence the outcome of a battle as much as brute numbers. The determination of 300 men fighting on advantageous terrain with a clear purpose proved to be more effective than the brute force of tens of thousands. The Battle of Hodow remains one of the most unequal confrontations in European military history. While the Battle of Thermopylae is more internationally famous, Hodow had an even more extreme numerical ratio. It was an improbable victory born of desperation, courage, faith, and perhaps a bit of luck. But above all, it was proof that numbers aren't everything in war. If this epic story of courage against impossible odds impressed you, subscribe to the channel for more fascinating content about historical battles that defied logic. Like and share with friends who love military history.